The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len Bier, and with me are Alex Hanna and Emily Bender. Dr. Alex Hanna is Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute. A sociologist by training, her work centers on the data used in new computational technologies and the ways in which these data exacerbate racial, gender, and class inequality. She also works in the area of social movements, focusing on the dynamics of anti-racist campus protests in the U.S. and Canada. She holds a BS in computer science and mathematics and a BA in sociology from Purdue University, and an MS and a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. With Emily Bender, Dr. Hanna is the co-author of The AI Con, a book about AI and the hype around it. Drs. Bender and Hanna also host a live stream and podcast series, The Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, Tearing Apart AI Hype. Alex has published widely, including in the journals Socius, Sociological Science, Mobilization, American Behavioral Scientist, and Big Data and Society, and has been a featured speaker at top-tier computer science conferences. Dr. Alex Hanna, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Emily M. Bender. She is co-author of the AI Con. Emily Bender has been a member of the faculty at the University of Washington since 2003. She is currently the Thomas L. and Margot G. Wyckoff Endowed Professor in the Department of Linguistics and the Faculty Director of the Computational Linguistics MS program and the Director of the Computational Linguistics Laboratory. She is an adjunct professor in both the School of Computer Science and Engineering and the Information School at UW, and a member of the Tech Policy Lab, the Value Sensitive Design Lab, and RAISE. Dr. Bender has served on the executive board of the Association for Computational Linguistics as Vice President-elect, Vice President, President, and past President. She is a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Prior to joining the faculty at UW, she held positions at Stanford University and UC Berkeley and worked in industry at YY Technologies. She received her PhD in linguistics at Stanford University. She earned her AB, also in linguistics, from UC Berkeley, and also studied at Tohoku University in Sendai, Japan. Emily Bender, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for that very thorough introduction.
I want to focus on your recent book, The AI Con. And we hear so much hype about AI these days, and it really seems like it's not a homogeneous technology. There are large language models, there are AI tools for simulated speech, there are image generation models, there are all kinds of AI management tools for accounting and logistics, etc. Could you describe the landscape of what we're referring to when we use the term AI?
So I think you nailed it there by saying it's not a homogeneous set of technologies. It doesn't refer to what we say as a coherent set of technologies, but in fact it's a marketing term to make whatever it's applied to seem a little bit sparkly or a little bit magic, and get people to jump on board with technology that in some cases is really quite janky and not a good idea. And whenever you use one term that sort of brings together, for example, large language model driven chatbots and image synthesis and chess engines and protein folding modeling and maybe weather prediction systems, it makes it seem like there's one thing out there that is getting smarter all the time, in quotes, rather than separate technologies built out of separate data sets, oftentimes very different algorithms, and used for different purposes.
And just to add on that, when you see something that says it's AI enabled, it's very confusing to understand what's under the hood there, and companies are often not forthcoming about what that is. You see this anywhere from facial recognition or emotion analysis, which are really horrible technologies because of what they purport to do, to chatbots, to things that could just be wrappers for spreadsheets and really basic types of analysis that you could do in Excel or Google Sheets.
And speaking of, Excel or any other software, for those of us who've had to use computers in our work or computing, all the computing devices we now have, including our smartphones, we're used to the idea of software, where an application is programmed to have a specific response to a specific command or a set of conditions. I've been around enough software to, have written some fairly complex programs where you have to meet a whole lot of different conditions to create different responses. But that's not the same as AI. And I wondered if you could help us distinguish what's the difference between what we think of as software in the older sense and artificial intelligence.
So again, I think we should. I mean, it's all software. I don't think it's.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it necessarily makes sense to distinguish quote unquote AI from software. I mean, there's a difference between, let's say, if going ahead and writing a program that is deterministic and has a deterministic outcome versus something that then operates based on a statistical evaluation. And if you want to be more specific about it, I mean, has been for quite some time the what is known as machine learning, and that is a technology, or rather a set of methods, in which instead of necessarily discerning, let's say we have a task like image classification, instead of writing a set of rules that say, let's distinguish a cat from a dog. Cats have, I don't know, pointy ears. Dogs have droopy ears, whatever. Very stylized example. This instead takes as a principle, let's provide through some kind of transformation this representation of cats and dogs and associate with them a label. And then there are elements of those cats and dogs that are learned, quote unquote, via these models. And so that's not even very new. I mean, that kind of pattern matching technology has been around since even when we started calling things, quote unquote, AI, I mean, since the 50s. And then effectively the capacity to learn more and more and use less and less kind of handcrafted features, as they're called, has occurred since these models have gotten larger and larger.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, as Alex already said, this is still software. It is software that in most cases is predicated on probabilistic modeling. And if you're talking about classification systems, then it is software that you would reasonably use in a case where getting it right some of the time is good enough, and writing down the specific rules for what you want to classify is difficult. But some of the systems are designed to probabilistically output things like text, and that is being marketed as something that can think, because when we see language, we imagine a mind behind the text, and it's not that at all, right? It is basically a system for mimicking the way we use language in different contexts. And then the reason we call the book The AI Con is that there's a whole bunch of fraud effectively built on top of that.
And you use the word fraud. I know that, for example, large language models, they're built upon looking at all the language that human beings have already put out there and sort of reassembling it, to use the term loosely. And you just said, you called it fraud, and I wondered if you could explain that.
Yeah, so the fraud is not in the creation of paper mache out of previously existing text. It is in the assertion that something that outputs language that looks like what a doctor might write is actually effective medical care, or something that outputs language that looks like something a teacher might say is actually an effective tool for education.
And I would add to that, so many of the different applications that we're seeing of LLMs and image generation tools are fraud oriented. I know Emily has said before the killer app for chatbots is fraud, and we're seeing this in different areas. And I'll give an example. There's something I came across weirdly where there was a video generated character on TikTok that said that they described themselves as a dwarf. They said they made these leather bags in Ireland, and then they set up a shop front of this design that was a public design apparently. But then the original workshop that made it was also selling these, and they did not have this TikTok presence, and so effectively they were using this extruded video generated character to sell this and rip off someone else's design. But we're seeing this in a lot of different areas, like in email scams, in the creation of, say, non-consensual intimate imagery. I mean, there's so many fraud applications for this, and so bad actors that had been operating kind of with janky tools in the past are now supercharging their practice.
In your
Hello.
book, you talk about how the hype around AI is being used to justify things like data theft, to enable more surveillance of the behavior of consumers, and that it's devaluing, excuse me, human creativity by replacing meaningful work with jobs that treat people like machines. Could you talk about data theft and about the surveillance that's occurring using AI?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So these tools would not work if it weren't for the massive amounts of data needed to train the models. And so books, newsletters, anything that's not nailed down on the public web, those are being scraped for ingestion of these models. And now we're getting to a point where the companies are saying, well, we're actually running out of data here because we're not able to generate anything quote unquote novel. And so, of course, this has come at the chagrin of many artists, many writers. There are many court cases winding their way through the U.S. court system and court systems in other countries, suggesting this is copyright infringement. This is not a quote unquote fair use of. This does not qualify for the fair use exemption in copyright law. And effectively, what that's doing is that so many of the artworks that these creators would be originally tasked with are now those kinds of positions are being either they're not available, there's job loss due to that, or they are being conscripted to fix the outputs of that work. And so we're seeing this in a lot of different domains, whether that's illustration or coding or any type of outputs. There was one study I saw that was talking about the introduction of work slop, so the kinds of very sloppy outputs on the job, and the ways in which that also decreases trust on the job if you see other people using that. But often, lots of people that were making their living creating creative works are being relegated to babysitters, fixing this, double checking it, something that is not really the full expression of human creativity, but is also very ripe for exploitation and being paid a fraction of the salary one would make if they had to build something from the original.
And just to pick up on the surveillance angle of it, the argument says this is, large language models, the image synthesis systems and so on, are evidence that we are just about there to getting what you might call artificial general intelligence, this magic technology that's going to solve all of our problems. And the only way we can build it, according to this argument, is by amassing enormous amounts of data. And so therefore, the companies doing this, who purport to be working to the benefit of all of humanity, should have access to everything that they deem to be data, right? So every time we choose to put a picture of ourselves on the internet, or every time we walk past somebody wearing Meta's surveillance glasses, for example, that becomes data in the eyes of these companies, and the companies compete to see who can have the largest collection of data so that they can then build the next version of these models, building ever larger data centers to hold the data and do the processing and so on. And the point of the narrative is that we are being sold this hype about artificial intelligence so that we will allow this to become normalized rather than resisting it.
For listeners who may just be tuning in, my guests are Dr. Alex Hanna and Dr. Emily Bender. Alex Hanna is Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute. Emily Bender is a member of the linguistics faculty at the University of Washington and on the executive board of the Association for Computational Linguistics. They are co-authors of the book, The AI Con, and we're talking about artificial intelligence. So you mentioned this essentially like a propaganda effort here to get us all to accept AI as inevitable and somehow believe that it's going to be beneficial in all ways. And I came across a quote from a corporate consultant. His name is Elijah Clark. He said, CEOs are extremely excited about the opportunities that AI brings. I can tell you I'm extremely excited about it. I've laid off employees myself because of AI. AI doesn't go on strike. It doesn't ask for a pay raise. These things that you don't have to deal with as a CEO. And I wondered if you could talk about that in the context that it's already the case that some 20% of Fortune 500 companies have less headcount now than they had 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite surprised the consultant said it so plainly because I think that's the labor threat that is underlying so much of AI hype. Effectively, machines can't complain. You can really bend folks over the barrel and really take, it really, really pay them poor wages or lay them off. And I think the thing that we say in the book is that these technologies are a cudgel against labor. You can threaten jobs, you can threaten livelihoods. And the thing about the layoffs is that so much of what the technology is purported to do or that it can do, it can't actually do so much of that. And so where there are layoffs, there are places in which the work product is done sufficiently well, and by saying that, it is typically always a decline in quality in it, but that is okay for those decision makers. And so that is enough of a replacement. At the same time, the kind of fixing of the outputs can be done offsite by contract workers, because there still needs to be that fixing that is done. In the cases of things, this is not a generative AI example, but things like self-driving cars or automated vehicles, they're not actually self-driving. They still require a lot of human input, especially in many cases that are anomalous on the road, like turning or confusing intersections or whatever. So that still has human involvement. And that's one element of the layoff story. The other element is because of the excitement around the technology, companies have to show that they're very excited about this and they can put a lot of money towards the technology. They lay off employees to show that they are committed to it, that is helpful for investors to see that there's some seriousness about this. But what that's effectively doing, it's putting more pressure and intensifying work on the employees themselves. Now, the secondary claim on this is that this is actually going to make people more productive, and that's actually not bearing out writ large across occupations, nor is it bearing out on macro level measures of productivity. And there's this vision that this technology is going to make people 10 times more productive. It's the myth of the 10x engineer that circulates in Silicon Valley. That's simply not true. It's fewer people doing more and having to integrate this tool that is very isolating, not involved in their processes, into their current work.
Yeah. Just if I could add on a bit, I was really struck in the quote where the consultant said, AI systems won't go on strike or demand higher wages, which, as Alex pointed out, very clearly says this is an anti-labor move. But on top of that, these systems are products that belong to companies that absolutely can, raise prices. And so what this consultant is saying is it's not okay for people to fight for a fair wage, but we don't care if other companies charge us more because it still looks good for our stock price to have laid people off.
And that seems like almost a snowballing of the hype. Like, you create an expectation, and then once you've created that expectation, you build on that by acting on it prematurely, really, or in a predictive way before you even have the means to get any real benefit from it. But you just keep doing this because, it moves your share price up, or it creates an expectation that it's going to go up, or whatever, that it seems like there's a lot of layers of really self-promotion going on here. Is that accurate?
It is, except prematurely suggests an expectation that the tech will work one day as well as is promised, and I see no reason to believe that.
Touché, yeah. So there's a good deal of talk about needing transparency in AI. And I guess, sometimes there tends to be a focus on, we need to know what's in the algorithms, or we need to know what data is being mined, or whatever it is. But it seems like there's also a lack of transparency in the motivation behind AI development or deployment. And I wondered if you could talk about that some.
Yeah, so I think there's actually three kinds of transparency that we need. First of all, what's in the training data? And I have done work with many others around data set documentation. We can't make well-informed decisions about where to use these statistical systems if we don't have information about the data that was used to build them and the data that was used to evaluate them. That's just like basic due diligence. And unfortunately, we are being hidden, or we're being denied access to that data because the particular data sets are treated as effectively corporate secrets, not least because a lot of the data was just appropriated and not taken fairly, right? We also need transparency about the bare fact of automated systems being used, right? You should know when the conversation you are having is actually with an automated system that is pretending to be a person, or in some cases with a person pretending to be an automated system pretending to be a person, right? So we need to know sort of what's going on. What are we actually interacting with here? The source of those words, to what extent does it actually speak with any authority that, let's say it's a company's chatbot, the company's going to be held accountable for. And then, yes, there's this third thing where in the face of all of this hype and propaganda, we are often being told we have to use the so-called AI systems, or at least get used to their presence, for XYZ reasons, which are not the real reasons. And that's part of what we're trying to do in the book, is basically peel back the curtain there and let people see better what's going on and position people to do that kind of hype analysis in the next wave. So since the book came out, there's been some new terms. So the whole idea about agentic artificial intelligence, or AI agents, is a little bit newer than our book, but it's exactly the same kind of hype. And the goal is for people to be able to look at that and say, aha, I spot the hype.
I would also say that in terms of transparency into what's motivating so much of this, I think just to put a finer point on it, the thing that's attempting to be solved for is wages. And I think so much of what we're seeing in the hype is it's going to either, kill us all, or it's going to lead to this era of what Mark Andreessen, a major investor in this space, has called like a consumer cornucopia. Effectively, productivity is going to rise so much that wages are going to rise, and consumer goods are going to get so remarkably cheap to produce. It's going to effectively be like this incredible world of human flourishing. But that's certainly not the case. That's not bearing out in any statistics. That's not bearing out in any kind of view of anyone that has touched grass recently. That is obscuring quite starkly what is happening economically in the labor force, and who is making a cash grab right now.
Well, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with more with Emily Bender and Alex Hanna, co-authors of the AI Con, right after this. Don't go away. Welcome back to Talk of the Bay. My guests are Alex Hanna and Emily Bender. They are co-authors of the recent book, The AI Con. And we've been talking about artificial intelligence and the hype around it. Your book gives some pointers on how to spot the hype, how we can discern the difference between, any meaningful information about what is being called AI and narratives that are just speculative or promotional. What are the ways we can all better view what's being put in front of us around AI?
Yeah, so we suggest some questions to ask whenever anyone is suggesting that we automate some system in our society. And it starts with looking very closely at the automation and saying, okay, what are we automating? What's the input? What's the output? Is that even a sensible mapping? So my favorite example of a sensible mapping is if you're talking about automatic transcription, the input is going to be a recording of someone speaking, and the output is going to be an orthographic representation of what they said. And that is not a fully solved problem. It depends a lot on how noisy are the conditions, what language variety is being used, and so on and so on. But it is something where the input signal plausibly has the information that you need to produce that output. Contrast that with systems that purport to determine whether or not a person is criminal based on a picture of their face. That is clearly nonsense, because criminality is a combination of factors of what is defined to be criminal in the society the person lives in, the actions of that person and people around them, and so on, and not at all determined by the person's face. So that's a system where it makes no sense at all. But I didn't make that up out of thin air. That's something we've actually seen proposed over and over again, because the people who work in machine learning will look at data sets where you have, for example, pictures of people, mugshots and ID pictures, for example, that they can put together into a classification system. And then there's going to be some signal in there, for example, the way in which mugshots are taken, that allows them to do better than chance in statistical modeling in this artificial task. So backing up to the questions that we ask, if someone is proposing automation, we have to first ask, does that even make sense? If you took that input, could you hope to get to a good representation of the output? If the answer to that is yes, like we're talking about the automatic transcription situation, then you say, okay, how well has this particular system been evaluated, and how does that evaluation match the use case that I have in mind? So if I'm going to take an off-the-shelf automatic transcription system and plug it into some voice-based phone system in my local community, I should ask, okay, who's going to be calling this phone? Is their language use similar to what was used to evaluate that system or not, for example? And then we can ask, why are we automating this at all? Who's benefiting from it being automated? Who's being harmed? And we should look sort of into the production of the system and say, who's labor was involved in creating this in the first place, and were they treated fairly? We can also ask about failure modes, right? What happens if the system gives an incorrect answer? And very often the motivation for automation is to be efficient, to speed things up. But if you've got something that is getting things wrong even 3% of the time, and it's going much faster, those 3% are going to pile up. And we need to ask, what have we put in place to provide recourse for the people who were given or were affected by bad outputs, where those bad outputs are happening faster and faster?
I would also add a few other things that we could see if the technology is being described as anthropomorphizing, if they're being described as human. So if we're saying, well, this is operating just like a nurse or a secretary, well, what is it actually doing there, and what does that mean? What are our expectations of what a nurse or a secretary is doing? In both of those cases, those are both very effective labor, and we're actually seeing quite a lot of that where the tools get described as very feminized styles of work, and so that's its own kind of analysis. But what does that mean, and what does it entail, and what is being lost when it's being described as that? When it's being described to replace a whole host of types of workers, okay, can it actually do that? And when there is kind of let's say a fully automated luxury future that is proposing, okay, let's back up and distinguish what's behind that hype.
Ai-jen Po, who's president of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, kind of spoke to that, and she was referring to the work that the National Domestic Workers Alliance members do to nurture children and support people with disabilities and take care of the elderly. And she said that work of enabling potential and supporting dignity and agency for other human beings is at its heart human work. Technology should be leveraged to support quality of work and quality of life as the fundamental goals, as opposed to displacing human workers. And that seems to be part of what you're addressing here is, does it really even make sense? And I wondered if you could talk about that some more, because Emily, you were just talking about why do we want a virtual whatever, a virtual psychologist, a virtual, or these sort of some horror stories I'm hearing about virtual girlfriends, stuff like this. Like, why invest resources and energy and intelligence and people's working hours into creating something that is obviously and absolutely inferior to the living version? And I wondered if you could talk about that some more.
Yeah. I think it's a combination in some situations of really devaluing the work that's being done, but other times people have identified a real need, right? There is not enough access to mental health care in the US and in many other places. And so that real need is used as an excuse to promote technologies that are absolutely not fit for purpose. And will sometimes get, well, it's better than nothing, right? To which the response is, first of all, no, actually it's not, right? The systems that output platitudes that sound like things that maybe come from self-help books or other kinds of psychotherapy contexts are completely inappropriate to put in front of someone who is in crisis and who needs more connection, not less, right? These are, as Chris Gilliard says, technologies of isolation. So it is worse than nothing. And also, why is the alternative nothing? Right? The alternative is nothing just for lack of political will. We could instead be focusing energy on building up the resources needed so that there is sufficient access to mental health care, sufficient access to physical health care, sufficient access to education. And that is a better answer. In fact, that is the only answer to these identified needs of the insufficient access right now. But it is definitely a sort of a risk point, because the people selling these systems can draw on the real needs of the people they purport to help as an excuse for pushing their tech into places where it absolutely does not belong.
Yeah, and just to speak to a few other elements of that. I mean, that quote from Ajan Pu is spot on. I mean, the kind of idea that there's so many of this type of relational work that is very hard to automate and shouldn't be desirable to automate. And domestic work is one. There's a great book by Allison Pugh, who's a sociologist, called The Last Human Job, in which she talks so much about the emotional labor and the domestic work and the kind of spiritual work that people do that is very necessary. And yet we see lots of different attempts to automate this actually. I mean, I think the AI relationship one is one that's very, very worrisome, especially because that is something that lives less in the domain of work, more in the domain of friendship and isolation. And so much of what we have in the US, but also all over the world, is the loss of public spaces, the loss of relationships that we can foster with people. And we have the case in which, because the tools are optimized for engagement, optimized to keep people on the platform, people are turning to those tools for chatting or communication or relationships. And that's really unfortunate. I mean, it speaks a lot to the ways in which governments primarily governments have really broken the social contract of ensuring that people have vibrant civil society organizations, vibrant places to meet and connect, and have really forced us into more of this individualistic, self-isolating type of environment. And so, yeah, it would make sense that so many people will turn to these technologies to identify or connect with something that seems like a real relationship, but is really not operating in that register.
Going back to jobs and work and trying to use AI to automate, or at least purporting to use AI to automate many jobs, I can see, having worked, being retired from a career in kind of an engineering area, we had to do a lot of data analysis. And I could see where AI tools could have sped that up a lot and made a lot of that sort of very tedious data analysis more elegant, faster, and easier. But as we've been discussing, to have AI actually take the place of human interaction is, to me, kind of crazy. I mean, my wife said to me, "Why do we need to put so many resources into artificial intelligence when we should be paying attention to the deterioration of our own natural intelligence and doing something about that?" And I thought that kind of encapsulated the issue in such an important way, that we're not only putting a lot of capital and research time and everything else into what we're calling AI, we're also using a lot of energy for, expanding data centers and new data centers to handle all this data all the time, which is not even original data. I mean, they're just processing existing data. It seems inevitable that AI will change many jobs, probably end up eliminating some jobs because it could take less people to do the same tasks. But it's a question of how it affects our identity, how we relate to each other. And I wondered, you've been talking about how these sort of virtual entities they're sort of a misplaced investment in terms of trying to enhance relationship. And that's something is that something that we need to pay more, like shift our priorities for?
So I have a lot to say here. Starting with, if you think about data analysis as a problem and think about what you want to automate there, Sure, there are many cases in which you would create some software to facilitate data analysis, but the situations in which you want something probabilistic, assuming you actually care about the results of your analysis, you need to have a pretty deep understanding of how the software you're using works. And just throwing like a chatbot in there that can give you an answer-shaped output is not going to do the trick. So yes, automation, I would not say AI, because, okay, what are you referring to by AI there? Secondly, to the idea that we should be focusing on, I think you said something like doing something about our own eroding intelligence instead of building artificial intelligence. I want to object to that notion that intelligence is a well-defined concept that is somehow eroding over time. What's eroding is the social contract. What's eroding is social services, our education system, our third spaces, as Alex was talking about. And yes, we should be putting energy, both sort of social energy and physical energy, into fixing those things as well as other kinds of resources. But thinking about it in terms of intelligence ends up sort of down this eugenicist track, which is not where we want to be. And then finally, in terms of relationships, which I think was the point of your question, yes. So again, back to Chris Gillard's point that these are technologies of isolation, and to Alex's point that we could be building up community resources where people connect, where they connect in meaningful ways, rather than feeling like we have to accept any kind of inevitability of tech companies being the platform for every aspect of our lives so that they can get in between us at every single point.
I would also like to I'm going to riff a little bit too on the kind of, if we're using intelligence, if we're going to play on the term intelligence, I do want to take this concept Ruha Benjamin has talked about with regards to ancestral intelligence, or the kinds of things in which we know from our own histories and family histories. We probably would call this, wisdom and the ways in which we interact with each other. And I do think there's a way in which, the kinds of ways and the kinds of people that we typically rely on, are interrupted by many things, and that can be displacement and colonialism and changing family structures and work. But we could also see that automation is definitely a way of forcing that and exacerbating that problem as well.
And just in defense of my wife's question, she was really referring and saying natural intelligence, referring to a sense of connection to nature and the dumbing down of the media and the dumbing down of education, that she considered that a deterioration, not so much of intelligence itself, but of our attention to our nurturing our own intelligence, just as a point of clarification. So we hear a lot of rhetoric in the public sphere around AI, but so far as I can tell, not a lot has actually been translated into policy that I'm aware of. Are government policymakers coming to grips with AI in a meaningful way?
So, on the national level, the short answer is no, effectively, because there's been so much stonewalling and discord. But also the fact that on the Republican side, it has been lawmakers have fully bought into the idea that we need no fetters on innovation. And so in Trump's AI action plan, it's effectively saying there's not going to be any limitation to what companies can do. We also see this on the Democratic side, where many of the lawmakers have pretty good relationships to the companies, and the lobbying has been so intense for companies. On the state side, we're seeing much more intervention. We've seen legislation be introduced around non-consensual intimate imagery. We've seen legislation be put forth around the use of these technologies in hiring. We've seen more and more interventions at the level of data centers, especially because so much investment is being put into data centers, but states are not really yielding tax revenues at the same rate. I was talking with an Ohio state senator. He said that Ohio ranks seventh in terms of the amount of data centers that they have there, but 27th in the amount of tax revenue that they're getting. And so states are really having to deal with this. And so we're seeing much more action at the state level, but so much of the AI hype really is slowing down, or it is jumbling up the kind of thinking of lawmakers, because a lot of the legislation, there's some legislation that has to do with preventing quote unquote existential risk, the idea that the machines are going to kill us all. There was a bill in California that effectively gestured towards that effect. And that's a lot of that's from just the sheer amount of lobbying money that's going into going into this at the state and federal level.
I'd like to add also that policymaking happens at many levels. So there's the state and the federal, but also things like school districts and specific organizations are creating policies around so-called AI use. And oftentimes these documents are over-informed by the marketing materials of the companies selling the technology. In many cases, the technology is being offered at a discount or maybe even for free to certain nonprofits. And so it seems like it's a good idea to take it on. And I would really encourage everybody who's involved in any of that kind of decision making to think very carefully about the mission of the organization and how these tools do or don't support that mission, as well as issues like privacy, for example, that are important ones that come up.
Well, it seems like there's a lot of action happening in small spaces, whether it's local action or civic action, and the action that's happening by through workers in their workplace resisting the role of AI, or at least the effects of AI hype on their jobs. Is there a possibility for a more democratic and humane use of these technologies where it's harnessed really just to serve human needs? Or would we be better off without it altogether?
So again, being specific about large language models, we don't see many different uses for these technologies because they effectively are trying to do everything and be everything to everyone. They are not well scoped. They are not well engineered because of the amount of cost of environmental costs, the data theft. There is no case in which the use of this technologies make sense for the public good. That's why when there's these kinds of claims around, I've seen claims around public interest AI or worker AI. Absolutely not. Let's be very specific of what these things are and what the technology can do. It makes more sense to have smaller, better scope systems that then work in the public interest. So for instance, going back to something we say in the book, we talk about the Luddites. The Luddites weren't anti-technology. They were anti these power looms that were destroying social relationships, destroying local economies, to make shoddy goods by people, often children, that were working 12, 13-hour days. To say we need a power loom that is controlled by the workers, well, it would look ultimately very, very different. It would say let's maintain and deepen those relationships, and let's have something that is better scoped. Maybe there is a loom that actually can be, that could be really controlled by workers and is done in an ethical way, but we wouldn't call it AI. We'd call it something different. We'd scope it to different types of civic technology or worker technology. So technology that is formed by workers can exist, but it doesn't look anything like what we have now.
Yeah, I would just add, if the idea is to somehow reclaim AI, that seems like the wrong path. So as Alex is saying, it is quite possible to create technologies that are controlled locally, that benefit the workers involved, that benefit the communities involved. But it is not possible to say we're going to take these same exploitative practices that are behind today's large language models and also the image text models and all of this, including the work that is done by data workers, especially in Africa, basically cleaning the outputs of these things so that the worst of the worst doesn't surface to the users, and do that under worker control, and that somehow makes it better. I don't think so. So the idea of artificial intelligence is just problematic from the start, the sort of ideology of we can replace people. And so I would love to see work towards technology and automation and even some, statistical processing systems that are driven and maintained and responsive to local needs with transparency about data sets, transparency about the fact of automation, and so on.
How can average citizens push back against the abuses of AI at work or as consumers, and how we evaluate the news we read?
So there's a lot of different ways that we can really push back against this. I mean, in the book we talk about collective action and also individual action. So collectively, we can think about different venues in which we can push back. I mean, one of them is at the workplace. So labor unions have been, I think, one of the big bulwarks against the intrusion of these technologies. We saw this with the Writers Guild of America and their 2023 strike. We've seen it with National Nurses United and their technology governance committees and the political education that they do. We've seen it with the Ziff Davis Creators Guild, with the New York Times Tech Guild. Lots of different organizations have pushed back and built contract language into their contracts, or that they've built these organizing committees that have really pushed back against the conditions that make these tools more attractive at their jobs. We've seen it also in different faculty governance. We encourage people who are teachers to take part in faculty governance and push back and suggest we shouldn't have these tools. They subvert the essence of writing and teaching and research, and universities and colleges putting so much investment in this actually is not really getting the point of the university. And so faculty governance is another very important venue. And then the individual level, something like we'd like to say on the podcast is ridicule as praxis. And so when we see this technology being used by decision makers or by companies, make fun of it, troll it. It looks like crap. It's slop. We don't have to accept this shoddy information ecosystem oil spill or all the slop that we see everywhere to be in our information ecosystem. And so make fun of it, especially make fun of power holders that are using this technology.
Alex hit all the high points there, but I also like to point out that refusal really matters, and I think it matters more right now than it will in a few years. If we think back to what it was like when plastic was first being introduced and it was pushed really hard everywhere, I think that refusal then probably would have had more of an impact than now, where it's really hard to avoid plastic in our everyday lives. And similarly, we are having synthetic media, text and image and everything pushed everywhere. And each time we refuse and each time we sort of remind ourselves we don't have to use that, we make it easier for us and for other people around us to refuse the next time.
Well, thank you. We're just about out of time. We've been talking with Alex Hanna and Emily Bender. They are co-authors of the book, The AI Con, and also host a podcast, Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000. And I invite each of you to give us a few words in closing, if you would, about the key message that we should take away about what we're hearing around this term AI.
So I have two catchphrases for you. The first is resist the urge to be impressed, and the second is take pride in your own expertise.
And I would say AI is not inevitable. That's pretty much the one I want to leave you with. And I think that's the big one. I was going to try to craft a new one on the spot, but AI is not inevitable.
Well, thank you both so much. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the program. I look forward to finishing your book, which I probably obviously had not read all of. And thank you so much for this really important work at this important juncture in the development of what is being called artificial intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you. Bye.